Thanks very much, Richard. So this is RADAR-CNS. RADAR-CNS stands for Remote Assessment of Disease and Relapse in Central Nervous System Disorders, and it's as Richard mentioned, it's funded by the EU, actually through the IMI funding stream, and it's a public-private partnership. So it's a pre-competitive public-private partnership with 5 pharmaceutical companies and 2 tech companies contributing alongside the public partners. And it's I think actually, just to say a couple of things about that. Firstly, this is about team science, right? It's absolutely critical for these sorts of big questions that you actually bring together a whole range of different disciplines, different sectors, different countries together. And this funding scheme allows that to happen in a kind of safe way. I don't think tech and academia necessarily have got this right yet, so we've been sort of finding our way here. And the second point is this little flag here, which I think very passionately believe that we're going to be in a terrible situation if we lose our access to these sorts of funding schemes. These are the partners, and it's something which is jointly led by Janssen and King's College London. So what are we about? Well, we're about trying to go from the situation we have now, where healthcare, in terms of delivery of healthcare and in terms of research, tends to be snapshots of sparse data, intermittent, often missing, of people who have already established a disorder. And we're trying to move through to something which looks more like this beautiful spectrum, where you're actually collecting data continuously, pervasively, and passively to get a sense of the individual's world around them. And you're doing that using harnessing the devices which you all have in your pockets, the smartphone, and some of you will have in your wrist a wearable device like this. So the idea is to see, and it's really testing our hypothesis, okay? We're coming at this with a kind of healthy skepticism. Can you actually get a signal out of these sorts of devices which tells you something which is informative for clinical care? And we're doing it in 3 disorders: epilepsy, MS, and depression. I'm going to talk to you mainly about the depression theme. One of the things I've learned about this, though, is that it's actually quite a good way of doing what I also do a lot of in my kind of clinical world, which is liaison psychiatry, of trying to instill mental health into physical health, because I think these technologies actually inherently are a good way of doing that if they work. What are we about? Well, okay, if you look at a disorder like depression, you imagine someone who's had a previous episode of depression, and you're then following them over time. As you know, depression severity is on a spectrum, so we have these kind of artificial definitions which define whether someone's relapsed, and you have them in a period like this where they're more symptomatic and you call it a relapse. There are certain activities which you could pick up from a smartphone or a wearable device which are these sort of things like circadian rhythms and sleep, or motor activity, heart rate, whatever it might be, sociability and so on, which might actually be indicative of the clinical state. So it might tell you something about when the person has relapsed. But it might also tell you something about this period here, where you might be able to detect a prodrome of relapse. So could you actually identify people before this episode has really started to happen? And of course, you've got to do something better than just being able to do what the questionnaire data would be able to tell you. Okay, I mean, you could be giving people a questionnaire every week or two, and if you're not actually able to do better than that, you might as well stick with giving them a questionnaire every week or two, right? But the point is that is an opportunity for intervention. And then if you think about it, what do smartphones and wearables have on them? Well, there's of course a huge amount of hype about this sort of technology, but I do think it's genuinely a very interesting window into a whole load of higher CNS functions, if you like. So, we think about cognition, and Tom Ince will talk much more about this, I'm sure. We think about cognition as something which neuropsychologists do in very detailed, in-depth, long, expensive testing, which you can only do from time to time on an individual. But if you've got a smartphone which is able to run an active app, or better still, some kind of passive technology which allows you to get a handle on cognition, then you're getting something which is very different and arguably richer, because you can actually look at change over time, you can look at what happens, and it's potentially very scalable and very cheap to collect. So all these sorts of things we are interested in collecting. And we're organized into 3 research clusters, a clinical disorders cluster, which is about running clinical cohorts, a technical platform, which is about developing the technology and the analytics to make sense of the data coming through, and a translational pathway, which is all about actually seeing this as something which might be deployed in the clinic. So you have to understand what patients want, what services actually are interested in. That's work which Chris and Richard and so on are working on, leading from Nottingham, and also what the regulatory environment is going to be like. Now, we are halfway through a long journey, a 5-year program, so I'm not going to be pulling rabbits out of hats and telling you the answer, but I'm going to give you some sort of flavour of where we're at. So this is the first bit about the technology development, and essentially what we've done is devised a platform, and this has been a bit like building an Airbus, lots of different contributions from different parts of Europe, led by this team here in King's, and essentially what this does is it takes in data which can both be passive or active from cognitive tasks like this one, or from questionnaire data or speech tasks, and it sucks it into the cloud, into a platform where the features can be extracted, and then real-time and batch or cold analyses can be done, and visualization can take place. So that in a nutshell is what the RADAR-CNS platform does. The point is it's plug and play, it's device agnostic, so you can take virtually any wearable device and put it into this platform. The other feature, which I'm personally very proud of, is that we made a decision that this has to be sustainable, and the way to make it sustainable is to make it open source. So the code is all there, it's available. We've got a website called Radar Base, which is where the computer scientists get together and work, and this is now being used in a number of other programs. The point being that once you establish that, you develop a community of developers around it, it becomes sustainable, and it has a hope of lasting beyond the 5 years we're funded for, which I think is really important. So this is what it looks like. We have an app on a phone, which isn't something but it's been developed with a lot of input from patients about the way in which it looks, and then the visualization, which you can actually do to monitor both as a researcher and ultimately as a clinician. The second component of this is the pathways, the translational pathways, and we've worked. I'm going to talk a little bit about the patient and public engagement work, involvement work we've been doing, led by Till Wykes, and it is essentially to make sure that the data are user-friendly, or that the program is user-friendly. So we've done focus groups in 3 countries with 3 disorders, so a 3x3 table, 9 focus groups, asking people with these conditions about their experiences and what would be helpful and what wouldn't. We've also conducted a systematic review, which I won't go over right now, but the sort of emerging themes from the focus groups are a mixture of enthusiasm. So most of the people we've talked to about this are actually very enthusiastic. They like the idea of having something which they hold, they own, they can take to their doctor and discuss. They see this as being very helpful and empowering. But of course, they also worry about some of the downsides. Is it actually going to be something which people will use? If you're depressed, are you going to drop out of it because you lack motivation when you become ill? Of course, that missing when someone becomes depressed might actually be quite informative, but it's something which our focus groups were considered. Also, is it inaccurate? There are concerns that it might actually make you more anxious because you're kind of constantly checking in on yourself, and that, of course, is a major concern. And also the epilepsy group concerned about stigma. They didn't want to wear something which identified them as having epilepsy. Another component of what we've been doing is looking at the landscape in terms of trying to find the right wearable devices. And there's a huge number of them out there. We were looking for finding ones which you could buy, you know, in a shop right now. They're consumer-grade devices, not necessarily research-grade devices. And we looked at that whole landscape and then did a lot of screening in terms of actually finding out whether they met our requirements and also the user experience requirements and particularly battery life. If you think about something where you're asking someone to wear something for a long period of time, actually battery life is probably going to be the single biggest determinant of whether they keep it on or not. So we ended up putting the different clinical work packages through this and actually making decisions, having structured it in quite a careful way. In the depression study, we're using the Fitbit Charge 2 as something which patients actually found very acceptable and easy to use. I'm not paid by them, by the way. And then the third component is the clinical studies. And the clinical studies are essentially cohort studies where we're following people with the condition over a long period of time, and we're doing three things, really. We're testing the acceptability of the technology. Would they actually use it? Would they actually wear it and tolerate it? We're also looking to see whether you can actually see whether the change in clinical state is something you can actually identify on the wearable or the smartphone in real time. So do you get a correlation between the kind of conventional outcome measurement and what you're getting from the sensors at a sort of cross-sectional point in time? But also the biggest question is, can you predict change in the disease or disorder state? So this is a difficult to read slide, but what it basically indicates is the depression protocol where we're following people over up to 24 months, and we're getting the passive streams from their sensors all that time. In red are the bars where you're doing the kind of standardized conventional assessment of outcomes in the kind of normal way you might do in an antidepressant drug trial or something like that. And then more frequent active tasks, this one being filling out a mood questionnaire, and also here active tasks around cognition and speech. So the idea is that you have this sort of structure which people are followed on over that 24-month period. And I think one of the things which is distinctive about RADAR-CNS is that there has been this sort of commitment to do it on reasonably large numbers of people. We're aiming to get 600 in depression over reasonable lengths of time, so probably on average about a year. We've got some people who's going to contribute more data than others. This is just to show, I think, something quite remarkable, which is the work of the team at the top there, Faith, Alina and Katie, who have been recruiting people with depression at the King's site. And it's one of those unusual graphs you see of recruitment actually going faster than your prediction. And it doesn't often happen. And it's partly because they're awesome. It's also because we've got some great recruitment platforms to use, which we've invested quite a lot in the Biomedical Research Centre where I'm based. But it's also actually that it's not hard to sell this to potential participants. They get it and they really like it. So I'm optimistic in that respect about the technology. Now again, this I don't want you to spend too long on this, but this is showing that actually we're converting quite well from having a contact with someone who's had an episode of depression previously and therefore potentially meets our eligibility to actually getting them the study. So actually this number probably should be 300 because it includes the people we're still trying to trace. Of that 300, we end up enrolling 120. So it's not a bad, it's a pretty efficient enrollment. If anyone's done a clinical study of this nature, you're pretty pleased to be getting that kind of proportion coming in. And again, not to spend too long on this, but this is just showing some of the details of the people coming in. Largely a female as you'd expect, given the nature of depression, and also we're recruiting people with existing depression as well as people who have recovered from their most recent episodes. So it's clinically quite a heterogeneous group, and that's deliberate because we're interested in fluctuations in symptoms rather than the state of relapse alone. And then this is just to show that we've kept people in. So in the first 3 months, only had 6 dropouts of people who've started in the first 3 months. So relatively good kind of retention into the study. Now, I didn't have any results, but this is our survey of people's satisfaction with the platform. And we started the study before the platform was completely up and running, completely as we'd like it. There were pressures to do this, but also we kind of merged the pilot phase in with the main study. But what you see is overall, this is the top one. Overall, I'm satisfied with this system. And broadly speaking, 80% are giving positive ratings of that, another 10% sort of neutral, and another 10% unhappy. And I think that refers to some of the difficulties early on we had with notifications. This one is the real killer, which is that the system was giving error messages people couldn't actually work out themselves. And I think a lot of those issues have been fixed, but that sort of acceptability is really important in sorting the system out. And this is just showing this is just showing some data coming from a Fitbit, which is maybe not too surprising, but you find that you've got someone who's taking a number of steps. You can see that from one day to the next that they're active, and they've got the heart rate, which is following a nice circadian rhythm. So the data's coming in the way we would hope it to. And this is, I'm nearly there, Richard. This is just showing GPS, and there's a poster upstairs on this, but it's showing that you can actually see here an individual who switches off their phone quite a lot. So some of the time you've got missing bars, whereas this one is the phone's on all the time. And this person, that's the same person, moves very little from their home, up to about 10 kilometers. This one, the scale has changed, and this one's making international trips all the time. But again, you're getting kind of information which is going to be important in terms of making sense of the other streams. So that's me done. That's our acknowledgement and disclaimer. Remember this, it's useful to have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.